Welcome to my city, cartographers and geographers. I'm excited to be on this panel because my research is in public participation GIS, and I actually wrote an ethics of public participation GIS several years ago with Doug Aberle. So that's it for me.
Just to make sure you're in the right place, this is the, make sure I get the title here, Ethics Mapping, Praxis, Theory, and Pedagogy session. So welcome bright and early this morning. I'm Craig Dalton. I'm at Hofstra University, and I'm hoping we can have a good, intimate conversation here. So I'm glad you're all sitting near the front. That's good. But the way the format here is, I've got a couple of questions. We'll have answers in brief, and then open up to a conversation with panelists and with you guys as well. So if I do a lot of running back and forth with the audience, I think that's a good thing. So did you have anything else, Renee, or should we pass it along?
Tomorrow we're holding a workshop on critical GIS at McGill University. If any of you are interested, it starts at 10 a.m. and it's in room 429 of Burnside Hall.
There we go.
So we welcome one and all to talk about the future of critical GIS.
Yeah. Look, now you know where to go, Carl. It's room 429. Hi, I'm Jim. I think about things and periodically say words. No, I'm at University of Washington, Tacoma. Britta, my sort of like twin, she'll be very happy that I refer to her as my twin. This is like a thing that matters to her. She can't be here because she had some personal reasons, and so you only get one of the sweet world of University of Washington, Tacoma. I hope you guys are ready. No, this is we put this together along the ideas of let's bring a bunch of incredibly smart people together in this room to talk about what it means to ethically map or not map. And I'll pass this off to you.
Hi, I'm Monica Stevens. I'm an assistant professor of GI science at the University of Buffalo, and my research largely looks at who has been left out and excluded by mapping practices and how those differences have reproduced and marginalized large groups of people. I'm excited to be here, so thank you guys for organizing this panel, and thank you, Renee, for bringing NACES to Montreal or bringing us to Montreal or however that works, but thank you guys so much for organizing this and coming today.
I'm Alicia Cowart. I'm the cartography lecturer and staff cartographer at UC Berkeley. So I teach a cartography class, and I'm also involved in Guerrilla Cartography, which is a nonprofit organization. We'll be giving a talk later on today. So I'll be talking both about my teaching and about what we do with Guerrilla Cartography during the panel, and it's very exciting to be here, so thank you. Very concerned about knocking over your water.
Go this way. I'm Jessica Breen. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky, and is this working? Did I kill it? Don't know what Jim's doing. I'm at the University of Kentucky, and for the past couple of years, my mapping activities have been teaching GIS, working with a project we have called Map Shop, which is this sort of outward-facing community mapping space where we help organizations make their own maps, and also doing community mapping as art. So
I don't need that.
Okay, so to get us started with talking about this stuff, one of the most frequently cited and ethically informed practices involving GIS and mapping, going back for quite some time, is questions of participation, how to get people more involved. And being where we are at this particular historical conjuncture, a lot of things are changing. Does that mean the questions are shifting? How do we deal with these issues? So I want to start off with a question. If participatory participatory mapping, participatory GIS is so useful and a powerful tool, what exactly does it mean for something to be participatory, especially now?
Right. So I could rant the whole session about this subject because I research it. Let me be somewhat provocative in saying that even though I had an article on public participation GIS, and I had last year an article on the participatory GeoWeb, I would argue that public participation or participation in general needs to be deliberative. It needs to be active and not passive. And that's one of the things that we have to struggle with as we're shifting technologies from technology and approaches from one in which we deliberately sat people in a room, or we at least knew who those people were, and they are around in a mapping session or around a piece of software, and they talked about what they were putting onto the map. We now have platforms that are anonymous or pseudonymous. You don't know who those people are. They often are not in collectives. They are individual. So that shifting what people want to call participation, so they'll often talk about passive participation, the fact that I don't even have to know that my app is on and that it's tracking, say, air pollution as I walk in space and time. I don't need to know that my geocoded tweets, as few as there are these days, are being harvested and repurposed in a way that inform policymakers. For example, I would still argue that to do participation, one has to be active. One also has to be informed. And one of the things that we're encountering now is increasing types of literacy that are needed. Not merely literacy around maps, although it's interesting how that's decreasing over time, I'd argue, and not increasing over time, or at least you have to know how a slippy map works. You don't necessarily know how to read a map anymore. That it's inclusive, which is quite difficult in a geospatial web setting where you actually don't know who's participating, but you can suspect that the participants are largely white and male and of a certain luxury of moving in space and time, and they have disposable income, and I'm sure Monica will talk about that as well, and that they have a certain degree of control, aka empowerment, over the process, which may mean that they have control over raw data. We can talk about what raw means in this instance, that they can do something with the data and with the maps that they're making. I'll hand it over to Monica.
So my answer is much more brief than Renee's, actually. That I think Craig asked us to look at the question that what qualifies mapping or GIS initiatives as participatory, and my what? That was your question that you told us, and my response was that it's a disruption of the top-down process through having multiple entry points into the database. And so this can be multiple entry points from geotagged tweets or from mobile technologies contributing data from multiple different sensors, with citizens as sensors, transversing the community. Or it can be with people crowdsourcing answers through traditional data points and also through municipal data. That we have a lot of ways that GIS can become participatory by giving the power to edit the database to another constituency. And that was pretty much all I was going to say, is that it just has changed from it being a top-down, one place, one person produces the data that everybody then absorbs unanimously to where we can all consume and produce data together.
Yeah, I actually had a sort of similar response where my thought about participatory means not top-down, so it means some kind of group effort. Anyone can be involved, and I'm particularly thinking about guerrilla cartography when we invite people to make maps for our atlases. We invite anyone, so people who are not cartographers, people who may just have an idea, so that people who maybe don't have the technical know-how to make a map have a really great idea, and they're partnered with somebody who can make that map. So that's sort of participatory in that way. And I think of it, as something where we don't have a hierarchy as much, although there's always a little bit of one. But yeah.
Can I just nod? Yeah, so definitely the bottom up and the active, not passive aspect, I think, is something that's really important for a participatory mapping project. The work that I've been doing with community mapping as art projects, the way that our grants are written for that, they really focus on how many people in a community that you interact with. So they're very numbers focused. They want to be like, oh, you had 50 people contribute to your map. And it's just sort of like, well, it's not hard to get 50 people to contribute to the map, but it's really difficult to get 50 people to actively engage and really participate in that. Like just putting the pin in the map that shouldn't count. So it really does need to be this very active thing. So.
I have nothing to add. My daughter is refusing to go to school, and I had to try to convince her that she should go. She's 4. It's, I have nothing of significance to add.
Okay, so participation. Any questions, comments at this point? I mean, one thing I'd like, something I've encountered doing some critically engaged participatory stuff, reaching back. I know at least one person in the audience, we've dealt with these questions before, of that if it means bottom up, and if it means having that engagement or people directly in the room, is how will we think about some of those hierarchies that Alicia was referring to, of who has which skills, and how we think about those kinds of questions if we want to open up the forum for map making a little bit more, and certainly in my own experience, a lot of the challenge for doing some work in these kinds of circumstances has been, how do we decide who does what and what is equitable and open, etc. Any thoughts? Anything to piggyback on that? Follow up on that?
Well, I just want to challenge this notion of disrupt. Disrupt what? Now, I come at it from an advocacy point of view, and there's a certain aspect of a participation that is play. It's Dionysian. So I don't want to discount that. And I just don't want to discount the representative potential, but when we talk about disruption, we usually talk about, and when we talk about disrupting authoritative sources, we usually talk about dismantling power structures. And there is a kitschy quality to disruption that could be just, I'm adding my point, fuck you, right? But that doesn't really profoundly impact people's positions on the ground. Monica?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I entirely agree with Renee. This isn't actually particularly disruptive for the majority's technologies, as it's the same class of people that originally produced and distributed the information that are the people who are crowdsourcing or collectively participating in the information. That before it was wealthy upper middle class white men who created the maps, it's still wealthy upper middle class white men who are creating the data that is participatory. So, if we're not engaging with new constituencies, yes, perhaps we can't say it's critical, but maybe there needs to be some word between participatory and critical, where it is somewhat in that it changes the distribution structure of the map, but it also doesn't change the class structures associated with it.
I have a quick question here. I wanted to follow up on something, Renee, that you said. I was just sort of curious if you could comment a little more on it. You mentioned that you believe map literacy is actually going down. And I'm sort of wondering, we've got so much more access to maps now. And I'm wondering what you see going on there with map literacy going down. And so I wondered if you could just comment a little bit more on that, because I found that really interesting. Is it, I mean, you were talking about more decentralized types of sort of participation versus being in a room. I wonder, does that have something to do with it? Or what do you see as this map literacy going down?
That's a cool question. Because I see a shift in applications more towards location-based services and geospatially aware devices, where when often when I think about map literacy, I think about a planimetric map. And I think that especially as our screens get smaller, although with phablets it's hard to tell, what the optimum size is eventually going to be, that the information is customized and delivered to our phones based on where we are. And even when we see a map, if, for example, in in-car navigation or when we're walking, it's not the same kind of maps that we necessarily grew up with, where we saw in toto the map. We had to find out where we were on the map first, and then, and read the symbology of the map. That it's a very different kind of cartographic experience. Does that answer your question?
There's a pleasure to being placed, and a lot of people who use maps these days enjoy that pleasure. Like, they're not. We would love to believe that they're looking at sweet maps that we've made that tell them things and like are well designed, but in reality, they're like, cool, that sweet blue dot, that's where I am, and now I know all these things around me, and there's an empowering moment where they can sort of, I did a lot of like just talking to people about this shit. And there's this moment where it's like, hey, I can extend my senses beyond, like I can extend my awareness beyond my physical senses, because I see where I am on this map and I see where these other things are around me. But it's always, like, where's the closest bar? Where's the closest, like, restaurant? Or, I mean, not always. Like, there are other uses to maps. But obviously, I would like to think everyone here would accept that. But, like, 90% of the time, like, people are just like, Google Maps, where am I going? Sweet. Off I go.
I think that's a great question. I think that especially when you're coming out of a teaching college perspective, you see this sort of rates of technical knowledge have dropped among students, especially undergrad students. And I don't know if you're experiencing this as I am, of new students come in and they haven't used a map to get from point A to point B because their cell phone has navigated them and given them turn-by-turn directions. But I think that also is a parallel to this sort of decline in technical knowledge that I'm seeing among undergrads. It used to be that undergrad students were thought of as like this sort of technical elite of they really knew how to use computers. They knew how to hack in and use Napster and exchange files and new file structures and that sort of thing. But now what I'm seeing is that through these programs that we have in the United States, at least, where they're giving, it's very easy for schools and cities to give grants to schools to give them large amounts of iPads, that students have never used a computer with a file structure when they come into an undergrad classroom. And that's, again, this big technical jump that's happening of that they just haven't had to experience the sort of old school technology where we had to like download a file and then unzip it and like have to have it in folders. And they haven't had to deal with those sort of file system things. So I think like there's just this way that technology is supplementing knowledge, and that's great at certain levels of society. It's also problematic in other levels of society.
As I pass this off, there's also a literature on wayfinding and mobile devices which shows some of the poverty of these technologies. I don't know if that's where you're going, Carl. But
No, not really. Sorry. I kind of want to bring us back to the participation question, because I found that exchange between Renee and Monica before the last question really interesting and revealing and insightful. And something that's been on my mind recently is, as I look around every year at this conference, as I look around at my own, the program I come from as a student, and now my students in the program I'm teaching in, obviously we have some diversity problems. And I think that was, admitting that, participation is not really disruptive to those, the sort of dominant society structures. I think we need to talk more about what participation means, because why is that? I think we're only getting a certain perspective, and what Monica said about the upper middle class people still making the maps, like, that's absolutely true. And why is that? So my question is, how do we get participation? We need different perspectives in control of the process, leading the process. I mean, I can go out, Renee can go out, Monica can go, we can all go out and do our thing and recruit people to make data. But what really needs to happen is some of those people, some of the people from the neighborhood or people from the reservation, should be the ones with the knowledge, with the advanced degrees doing this stuff, right? Like, so how do we get more participation from underrepresented groups where we are in the universities all the way up through PhD, so that we can have different perspectives in our field?
The one thing I want to say is it's incredibly dangerous and hard, right? Like, just if you historically look at the people that tried to do this, and I'm, of course, going to pull us back to Detroit, but, like, those people got driven out of the academy. Like, Clark got driven out of the academy. Bill Bungie got driven out of the academy for good reasons. He had problems. But, like, they went to one of the most powerful things historically that we can take from the Detroit geographical expeditions and the expeditionary method is that it's not that we sort of show up in a neighborhood and say we're going to map shit. It's that the people in those neighborhoods determine what we're going to map and how we're going to do it. And that's the profoundly important, for me, that's the message that we take from that. But if we want to wonder why we're not all about that, why we're not all out in the cities talking to people and making maps of that nature, none of those people got tenure. And there's this harsh reality where we're all like, wouldn't it be great if we did these things? And then there's this harsh reality where, like, I have a couple kids, and I provide food for them, and the history of Clark Akatif, and I mean Ron Horvath is a great example as well. We can go back to the 60s and we can look at people who went and tried to do this and what happened to them and how the academy basically told them to GTFO. And, Isn't that the system that works? Right, yes, that it is. So like there's this balance between our revolutionary awesome, and this is a personal, you guys might have different experiences, but this is a personal issue for me where there's my revolutionary impulse where I'm in Tacoma and there's a lot of social inequity in Tacoma, and I want to go out and I want to map that and I want to help people map that. And then there's also the fact where I want to also keep my job, and I want to I am socialized in certain ways to perform in certain ways so that I end up getting tenure. And, that those ways aren't necessarily the ways of really doing revolutionary, amazing mapping that I know is out there. and there's the easy answer of saying, oh, well, once I get tenure, I'll do it. Come on, Jim. That's totally a lie, and you know it. It's a lie I tell myself. Oh, yeah, probably. Like, probably. You would have a lot to say about this.
Okay, sure. All right, microphone is weird. I'm just gonna Okay. Hi. Okay, I'm gonna try. So I kind of want to sort of build on what Carl is saying. I think I disagree with the latter part of what you're saying. Like, because of people that are doing awesome things like Carl with the community college system, I think it is a different system in a bunch of ways, and I'm speaking somewhat from experience as well. But coming back to what you were saying before about it being hard work, and I started thinking about, in that first question on participation, debates in science literacy and public engagement with science, in science and technology studies adjacent to cartography of sorts, in which if you look at some of the issues in public engagement with science, people are like, why aren't more people of color engaging? Why aren't more female people engaging? Why aren't more people who are not rich white dudes, rich white cishet dudes who are engaging? And I think some of that's a framing issue where we have this sort of assimilationist paradigm where, like, if we go out there, we will get the people to engage, as opposed to saying, like, look, actually this stuff is already out there. People are doing this thing. We're just not seeing it because we have this narrow definition. And in public engagement with science, one of the sort of relevant counterpoints is the environmental justice movement, where people are totally engaging with science. We're just not calling it that because it doesn't fit our science literacy, like use the certain book, gain the certain kind of knowledge that we're looking for. And so I'm wondering if, I'm sure from at least some of y'all's introductions, you've been doing this kind of work and engaging with the kinds of people that Carl was talking about, that it seems like is sort of undergirding the aspirations behind a lot of this participatory work. And so I'm wondering what it would look like, or what it does look like in your work in a less kind of assimilationist, like go out there and get more people to map tweets view.
There's two different things that came up, and I wanted to speak to what you said first of I don't always understand, if I can't convey to a community member why we are mapping them or why they should map, then maybe they don't need to map. Like it's kind of imperial of me to go into the east side of Buffalo. Buffalo's a heavily segregated city. It's beautiful, but it's very segregated. There's one side of Main Street is rich and white, one side of Main Street is poor and black. Literally. And I'm not going to go, and I can't come up with any reason why somebody on the east side needs to be represented on OpenStreetMap. Like, I can't say, you should give up dinner with your family to contribute some roads and structures and features to OpenStreetMap. Why should they? What is it going to ever do for them? Why should they be mapped? Why should they participate in this tool for my benefit? Yeah, it would benefit my research. It would be great if I could say, like, there was a reason, but if there's no reason that they need to be mapped, why should they?
Why shouldn't they be a PhD student at SUNY Buffalo?
I would love to have them as a PhD student at SUNY Buffalo. I'd say the large difference is that the matriculation rate in the high schools is that about less than half finish a high school degree on the east side of Buffalo, and that's why they don't end up getting a PhD, is largely because they don't get a high school degree, and they often don't get GEDs. There aren't the structures in place. The charter school system has gutted the public school system in the city to an extreme extent. And like the schools they can get a high school degree in hospitality management, but they can't get one in social sciences, mathematics, that sort of thing. So the hospital and the charter school industry is just reproducing inequality at really, really extreme rate. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
And then I think your question of why aren't we doing more awesome stuff, was that your question?
No.
Oh.
No, that wasn't her question.
that was a good question.
If we don't look at cartography or participatory GIS as sort of assimilationist, like let's just go out there and bring people in, what kinds of projects are out there that are trying to do participatory work in a way that's not that assimilationist model? And kind of what you said about not going out there if we don't have a reason to, and not trying to like just sort of mindlessly like add diversity.
Right, I mean, yeah. I think one of you can speak to that better.
You want me to talk about guerrilla
Yeah,
cartography?
I
Okay.
really do. You don't have to.
No, it's okay. With guerrilla cartography, we just put out a call for maps, and of course, the people who receive those calls I'm sure, are already self-selected to be mostly middle-class white people, because we have a bunch of email lists, and they mostly come from like NACIS and our personal, contacts. And what we hope, though, is because we're so open to, you can do whatever you want. This is an atlas for the people, by the people, etc. We hope that we get a diversity of perspectives, and that's the whole point, is to get a bunch of different maps of different things within sort of a broad theme. So our first atlas was on food, our second one's on water, so you can map whatever you want. And even if you don't have the skills to make that map, even if you just don't know where to find the data, but you have a really good idea, you can also participate. So you can put an idea out there and be partnered with a researcher or a cartographer. So that's sort of our model, and our hope is that we get a lot of different perspectives from everyone. We're currently challenged by the fact that most of us live in California and most of our contacts are in California and the US, but we're trying to get more people from all over the world. And we have a few maps in our atlases that are sort of more from people outside the US.
Renee, and then we got had a hand for a while.
So I'd answer your question in two ways. One, skins on top of OpenStreetMap, and with all due respect to Alan, are all well and good. But I would put to you, one of the grand challenges in cartography will be scale variant maps. So in which the scale varies within the map extent. And if we can do that, and we can have big houses when they should actually be small houses, then that will go a long way towards creating a non-assimilationist, whatever you think about what you value or hate about your place does not have to conform to the extent and the resolution. The representational fraction will help a lot. And second of all, a lot of the non-assimilation practices are consulting contracts. So I'm thinking about my colleague John Corbett at University of British Columbia, and he has a big community GIS lab, and it's funded through contracts, and most of his contracts are with Indigenous peoples. Now, of course, in Canada, Indigenous peoples have slightly more power and authority than in the US, but they do also have some amount of money, so they can contract out with John to do participatory mapping the way the Indigenous groups want the mapping done.
Sorry, I don't know your name, but Alicia, okay, yeah. So regarding your atlas of and by the people, I assume there's going to be an editorial board who will decide what content actually gets published. And I'm wondering, how important is it that the makeup of the editorial board be diverse so that they choose from it? To me, it seems what we're kind of getting at is, are the decision makers, not necessarily, I think there's an issue with making sure the data doesn't get biased by white guys, but the next level up of decision making, or the higher level up of decision making, strikes me as the place where an even bigger impact by what is chosen to be mapped and displayed.
So I just want to respond to that by saying that we are thinking about that, and actually our editorial board is mostly women, and Molly, who I'm going to point out right now, was one of the founding editors of the original food atlas by Guerrilla Cartography, and she could probably speak more to this. I don't know if you want to speak, but
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna sit right here. Yeah, I would say that I'm actually currently leaving the board of guerrilla cartography, one, because I'm just doing my own other life things, but also I do think that I do think we as guerrilla cartography need to think more about diversity, but I know also that the people on the board who are mostly white are consciously thinking about bringing more people on the board. And I would agree that a really big issue with participatory mapping stuff is the process of, like Carl was saying, and I don't know who the other woman is, but of getting people of color in positions of power, I think is one of the main ways to be able to not only, because they were talking about the assimilation point, which is an extremely good point because people have viewpoints about mapping that are really different. Like I've been seeing at this conference that even the questions of how to map perspective and orientation are all givens and are not questioned so much as they could be. But when you get people who think differently about wayfinding and about moving through space and about how to view different things in relation to themselves and the rest of the world, when you get people who think differently, then when they get into positions of power, then they can think about how to map those things differently. And so I think that it is really, really important to get people who have different sorts of experiences into positions of power themselves, not just let's work with them who are on this lower level, but how do we get them up to the higher level? Because as people were saying on the panel, hierarchies do exist. And so, yeah, how do we balance those out? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, one quick comment, and then I'm going to push us along.
Yeah, well, maybe this will push us along too. I was just going to echo too on the this sort of assimilationist point that like these conversations are definitely happening in other places, right? Not in NASIS. Like the Allied Media Conference is a really good example of places where pretty high level conversations around like design and mapping are happening, led by people of color who just don't identify as cartographers. So that's a question. And I think there's maybe like an interesting riff with like Alan's talk on professional amateurs about like who feels comfortable defining themselves as a professional amateur, like who feels comfortable walking into a room and being like, I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to do something useful. That's not always easy to do. But I guess my question is like, I feel like so many of the participation conversations are focused on the inputs, like and then there's so little thought given to like how is the map actually relevant to the lives of people of color or folks of different class backgrounds. And like I feel like in my own work it's been maybe more useful to like stop worrying so much about who's making the map and start worrying more about like who's using the map and are they finding it useful to their lives. And like I wonder like maybe if we do that first, because that's also something that I have a lot more control over rather than like trying to get someone in a room when they don't have a lot of time, then maybe people then become more interested in participating in mapping because they see that it actually is relevant and interesting to their lives.
Great. I want to follow up then for the panelists, it's question 6. And the question involves, if it's questions about who is involved or whether it's in the production or the other end, questions of how do we teach these questions? How do we engage these kinds of issues in the classroom with our students? And make sure I hit the points there. And in particular, Wilson and Elwood and Wilson have put out an article recently saying that we need to get beyond the idea of teaching ethics in a single week at the end of the semester. So thinking about how we can begin to do that, whether with their approach or something else.
I just want to say that often when people talk about ethics, what they're talking about is morality. They're not talking about ethics. And it's, how many people are geographers here? Okay, well, about half of the people are geographers. It's a thorny, when people usually talk about ethics from philosophy, they're talking about whether something is instrumentalist good or a right or wrong, a Kantian question. That's a thorny question for geographers because we like to critique. That's not ethics. Ethics is telling students what's right and wrong. And I teach a course called The Principles of the Geospatial Web. So I don't teach GIS anymore. I teach usually with map box and leaflet. And it's so technically complicated to teach that often you do feel compelled to push things to the end. And students are attracted to these courses precisely because they're ethics free. There is no, or rather there is an ethic, and the ethic is to do a right map. But so ethics are there from day one. It's just we want to think about ethics as morality, and we want to think about ethics as politics and power.
Well, I guess the last time I had this mic, I was like, let's pay attention, our jobs actually matter. But to follow up on what you just said, so at my university, over 50% are non-white, and I'm really proud of that. I don't contribute to that, obviously. I can't. And over 50% are first generation. Like, this is the university I'm at prides itself in serving communities that are not traditionally served by large university structures. And so there is a neat thing there where when they come to GIS classes, they come to learn Esri because that's going to get them a job in their minds. And that is more or less true, and I can navigate that as being more or less true. But the first year I was there, I'm like, look at me. I'm like this clever social justice aware white dude, and I was like, I'm going to teach you all open source stuff. And the number one critique was, I can't get a job out of this. And these are first generation non-white students. And I was like, well, all right, man, I guess we gotta pay our tolls to the hegemon. To the degree, I'm not all like, here's how you click buttons in Esri. Let me give you a degree in that. But it is a thing that you have to be aware of, and I guess what I'm saying is that there's this tension, and it's a tension that's difficult to navigate. And it's a tension between, say, my impulses to map for what I perceive as social good and social justice and the privilege that I have in making those maps versus, for example, my student that, no one in her family has ever gone to college before, and she is fronting a bunch of money to come and talk to me about, how to get better at a certain skill set. And that's really hard to navigate. I don't have an answer for the best way to navigate. I imagine all of you navigate that as well, in different ways and in different directions. It's just that one of the things that's constantly in the back of my mind when I'm at these amazing spaces where I can talk about, I have my tin socks on. My socks are like tin networks, right? Which is a joke that I get to wear here and people will get. That's not what my day-to-day pedagogy might be. I mean, I wear these socks and my students love it and it's fine. But, we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of what the contract is. Why are people coming to us? What do they expect, and how can we serve them? And that's just, it's hard. It's hard to navigate. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, I think it's
everything's hard.
I like that you guys brought Elwood and Wilson's article into this question, because that article starts with their student evaluations from teaching a sort of ethics and GIS course that was like, this is all great, but could you tell me more about what I can do with ArcMap? And I was like, well, okay. But so the way that I do it and the way that I get around it is I bring kind of ethics and representation into every single conversation. So we're talking about symbolization. Let's talk about Chernoff faces. Let's talk about the ways that this represented African-American men in Los Angeles in the 70s. Let's talk about this idea of this angry black men. Let's talk about projections and this representation of the North. You know, and these are, I similarly teach a 100 level, a very large 100 level undergrad class that actually I based my syllabus somewhat off of Matt Wilson's at University of Kentucky. So you know, it is similar, but then I largely have them using the Google Maps API at the 100 level to do all sorts of different things of mapping spatial databases and talking about that. But again, when we talk about databases, we talk about how databases are raced. We talk about a lot of the algorithms and how those algorithms create data and how that might be bringing in perspectives. And I use examples of sketch factor. I think a couple of us were talking about this in the hall the other day, and how it uses terms like, oh, I would avoid that area because it's the ghetto, and thugs playing rap music. And we talk about these terms, and we talk about how those terms end up being removed into a database, and then that database is reproduced several times throughout the technology. And that's how I bring it in anyway, because I really feel that what separates GIS and geography as a discipline from a marginalized trade school craft is our focus on theory and our integration with sort of the ethical bodies of what are we doing. You know, they could go and get a degree in like auto mechanics, and they don't have to think about what is the larger impact of having that car on the road. They don't have a conversation. I've never taken an auto mechanics class, but I imagine that they aren't having a conversation about should we be fixing cars? Because more cars, more pollution, more problems in the world. I don't think they are having those conversations at the community college auto mechanics class. I don't know, but I think that one of the things that makes us a stronger discipline is that we're thinking more broadly and more critically about the practice that we are teaching our students.
So actually, that's a great way to follow up. So I actually teach a course that is considered a methods course in cartography. And luckily, it's a 5-unit course, which means it's like a lot of time with the students. So I get to do a lot of things. And I actually start my class with thinking about what is a map. And we read part of The Power of Maps, and we talk about power structures and about who makes a map. Why are they making this map? And it's actually, I think it's a great way to start a cartography class where students are expecting to go in and immediately start clicking buttons because you really have to sit back and think about what you're doing first. And similarly, I also try to bring in these discussions with projections and other things that we talk about. And we do a variety of different software packages. I try to give them like lots of different things. So of course they want to know ArcMap because that's what, you know, they might get a job using. But I try to bring in a bunch of other things as well, and I'm trying to increase the number of different programs that they end up using, because even though it's annoying for them, it's actually going to be very useful for them in the future, because technology is always changing. It's changing so fast. You're going to have to continuously be learning something new all the time, and that's a skill that I would like for them to develop. Is that they will just have to get used to learning new technologies, new skills constantly throughout their lives and careers. So I think that one of the great things, like she was saying, is that one of the great things about cartography is we can really do both. So we can really think critically about what we are doing, but also practically do it, which is great.
So it's been a few semesters since I've been inflicted on students, but when they did let me teach GIS, so I've done work with the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science, Public Lab, for a few years. We do a whole bunch of sort of citizen science, a lot of environmental justice and social justice issues, but there's a whole mapping aspect of it, this balloon and kite mapping that we do. And so I would start off the class by talking about a particular case from, I think it's Uganda, a market that was going to be erased by the local government said it didn't exist, even though a lot of people made their livelihood off of this space. It was an illegal market. And there was this whole case study of like the people who had the market knew that if they were on the map that they could argue that they had this space and they needed to have this space. And so there's this whole story of like the community mapping themselves and coming into conflict with like Google Earth, that they didn't show up on Google Earth because the imagery was from the wrong time of year. And then having to find themselves on OpenStreetMap and just going through all these technologies that we use for cartography and finding themselves erased or named wrong or just on there in weird ways. And their sort of story of putting themselves on the map and what being on the map on their own terms could do for them. And so I start students with that about like, okay, so this is what maps can do and what, communities can do with maps, and trying to put them in this mindset of like, you do not get to be the authority of maps in what we're going to do with communities. Like, you have to listen, and you do have a sort of an ethical charge to not do harm to other people, and to start out with this concept of considering, what happens to their maps when they let go of them, the sort of unintended consequences of our mapping and what that does. So I try to start them out with ethics and actual case studies of ethical mapping being done and participatory mapping.
Okay, so to follow up on that, I mean, NACIS is not all college professors and teachers, and I know there are a lot of folks out there in professional practice, so how do we engage these questions, as Renee was referring to earlier, with clients or with community partners? I mean, I've certainly had people approach me about making a map, and I was like, I'm not going to do that. But some of the experiences or some of the reflections may have about those kinds of situations.
Well, once again, I question the use of the word ethics, because I think when people say it, they really mean power, political power. So, I mean, if a discipline has a best practice or an ethics of best map making, then the discipline fulfills that. I mean, so somebody comes to you, oil and gas, and says, I want you to make this map, and you say, no, that's a wrong use. It should be a choropleth. It's the wrong use of a color ramp or symbology. You are fulfilling the ethical issues. Okay, so the issue then becomes, what do you do when it's a power issue? And when you ideologically do not support pipelines, and yet your university or your lab can get a good deal of money from doing a spatial analysis of a pipeline to show that it will not affect an indigenous community or a watershed. That becomes a challenge, and then to some extent you have to turn it down. I mean, I would argue that you have to turn it down because you cannot follow the best practices of the industry to do the spatial analysis or the geovisualization.
So I really appreciate this question of how do we navigate it, because I don't totally have an answer. So I would love suggestions for anyone who does have answers on how we can navigate this. I was in this position this year of applying for a $3 million grant with my dean for algorithmic threat detection to the NGA, and NSF had a joint call for proposals, and my dean said, I would like you to join me in applying for this. I'd like to use Twitter data, and you're the best person for this. And I was like, well, I'm very flattered, but I just on principle don't want to apply for NGA money. And my chair was like, no, you do. You really do. And so I was like, all right, so now how can I repurpose this process in a way that maybe it can't harm anybody, like let's go back to the Google ethics of don't do harm, and then secondary, how can I have some byproduct of this that could help communities? In so many ways, like I look at really old DoD grants that later had the impact of products that came out of that were actually helpful in different ways to different constituencies. And so what I ended up doing is putting forward a proposal on integrating soft data and hard data, or Twitter data and drone data, as a way to respond to emergency situations as threats. So after a terrorist attack has happened or something like that, how can we integrate these different data streams? But it's still like this ethical question of, I can't really say no. What do I do to lessen the impact of this? And we didn't get the grant, and I didn't know if I should be like cheering and being really excited that, yes, we didn't get it. Somebody probably who put together something around facial technology detection or something else probably did receive it. I actually don't know who got that $3 million because there was a limited number of proposals. So I think about that a lot. And then I also think with my community partners, I've had a lot of conversations about anonymized data and what the power of completely anonymous data is within communities. And so I'm writing a paper with one of my PhD students where the Homeless Alliance of Western New York shared with us just a completely anonymized file where when a homeless person checks into one of the different homeless shelters in the city of Buffalo, one of the intake questions is, what zip code were you in immediately before you became homeless? What is the last place you were? There, we don't have any identifying information. We just know that. And in talking to the Homeless Alliance of Western New York, they were like, oh yeah, there's lots of these intake people, they just enter, like these random 3-digit numbers because they're not getting a zip code on everyone, and I don't know what that is. We just delete that and realize all of these analysis of homeless in Western New York and all these mappings had deleted anything that wasn't a 5-digit zip code. And so those of you who don't understand how zip codes work in the United States, the far East Coast is like 05045. That would be like Vermont. 0 something would be Massachusetts as well. Like the East Coast often starts with zeros, but Puerto Rico is 3-digit zip codes. And Puerto Rico they had marked every single entry from Puerto Rico as being a data error. And so it was kind of this conversation with them about all of these zip codes map perfectly to places in Puerto Rico. There's another pattern here that's emerging, is that there's actually a large homeless population of people coming directly from Puerto Rico to Buffalo, New York. What's going on there? And they're like, we've never heard of such a thing. We've never considered it. And then just getting into these questions of so what are we able to do with anonymous data? And we don't have to worry about the ethical implications. We don't have to worry about it as a weird way of putting it, but we can actually have a lot of power without hurting people.
So having to explain my mapping ethics to clients is a lot harder than explaining it to students. Students, I get up in my soapbox and they kind of have to listen to me, and they kind of have to do or not do what I've told them not to do. It's been more difficult working with community partners. I made a map recently that I was asking people to put lost places on. It was supposed to be a psychogeographic map of lost connection to home. And it got misinterpreted as where are the old buildings that were torn down. And so I was trying to explain it to someone. They're like, oh, well, there's a Facebook group where people write all these things. And they talk about oh, I used to go to this place and I used to go to that place. You could just put that on the map. Because it wasn't getting a lot of participation for this art project. And they're like, well, your project's failing, so you should just go harvest these things. And I was thinking about it. And it's where I ran into this moment of realizing that it isn't ethics, it is morality when I say that I won't map these people. It was like, I have actually no idea how to make this clear to you about why I find that morally troubling to go onto that website and pull off people's stories and then shove them on a map. Even though I totally think that those people would like that map, I do believe that they would find it interesting to see their stories on a map. But I can't do that to them. And I really had no good way of explaining it to this woman who was telling me, no, you just do that. I was like, my soapbox doesn't work in front of you for some reason. And how do you explain that to someone who doesn't have a concept of that you find it immoral to map people without their knowledge? It's that doesn't translate outside of the field because it is that weird sort of mapper specific concept. So not a good answer, but an experience.
One comment I hope to make was just in navigating some of the complexities or issues around the politics of academia and tenure and all these different things. As a master's student, I'm a master's student in GIS at the University of Minnesota. And I think one of the things that we could be doing more of is really leveraging the power of students to be collaborators in community GIS. in their own right. So, for example, I got a chance to work with an undergraduate class that had no prior GIS experience to do the class was an environmental justice class that was partnered with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and a bunch of great community partners throughout Minneapolis to do community GIS, do mapping. So I just, as a student, kind of did a few workshops with the undergraduate students who had no prior GIS experience, got them to a place with Collector and Esri products to get out there, and Esri in this case happened to be the easiest way to work because students at the university had access to that. They were able, again, to get out and collect really important data about the impact of air pollution and other things on communities in Minneapolis, primarily communities of color. And I think sometimes we just need to ask more of students, and to actually know that a lot of students, I think, will take that upon themselves. So in thinking about leveraging who's in your classes in the partnerships or the community, or excuse me, the relationships they might already have. So a lot of students, undergrad or graduate students, they might be activists, they might be really engaged in community in a way that you're not as someone in the ivory tower, as it were. So I just challenge that's one potential solution, is trusting the knowledge and the abilities of students to get out there and do some of this work through their existing relationships.
So I was actually Matt Wilson's TA for his community map shop course. And that was one of the interesting things. So going from the intro students, so the map shop course is actually the second class that people will have had in GIS. They'll have to do intro, and then they can do this class where we actually do set them up with a community partner. And they work with a community group to do a mapping project. My work as an RA was to provide continuity between the different semesters and have somebody who still knew where all the data was between class changeovers. But the students, they leveraged their already existing community relationships. We had a student who was already a tutor with an organization, and she did some really great work around the housing situation for the kids who were at that tutoring place. The students do awesome and amazing work when you give them the tools to do that. There are sometimes instances where you have to sort of dial them back a little bit about, like, yes, you are really smart and you're doing really great things, but you can't walk into this community and be like, I will now map you, I know all the things. Like, you still have to be a partner. And so getting students to recognize their partnership. And some students do come with that already, and it's awesome when they do. But yeah, we have tried to actually do that. And I think it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, I would actually, I have had a similar experience where for my class, students can do whatever they want for their final project, as long as it's a map. And I think some of the best things that have come out of this class are students that are already involved in some organization or are just getting involved in an organization, and then they say to this organization, well, do you need a map of something? And then they're able to actually, like, help this organization along with doing something, learning something for the class. And I think that there was one organization, and I'm forgetting the name, but they were mapping out these sort of privatized parts of Oakland and Berkeley where homeless people were being harassed and, basically kicked out. And that was actually a really powerful partnership, because they were able to make maps of these areas where homeless people were being harassed. And hopefully, I need to contact them again, but hopefully we can continue those kinds of partnerships.
Okay, so we just have just a few very short minutes left. So the way I want to wrap this up is one of the questions in the middle, but I think it's a good place to end, is what do you think is one of the most overlooked ethical, or, as Renee quite rightly points out, political, moral questions in the field now?
I think this was mentioned before, that often when you engage people, they don't want to map. So how do you navigate that when you go to a community group? And this happened a lot in public participation GIS. It's like, no, we want a community health center. We don't want to participate in your mapping exercise. So I think the cartographic imperative or cartographic determinism that we say any problem can be mapped, any problem is spatially distributed. It's not always.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think I've already said my piece on this is just that it's that tension between our radical impulses, which are good, and our students' radical impulses, which are great, and then, I have this brilliant student. She's a mother of 3, and she's getting a degree so she can get a job, and I need to best position her to be able to get a job, and because that's her life, and I have an ethical, I feel that I have an ethical responsibility in the contract that we sell to our students, and I didn't create that contract, and I think geography as a discipline has some things to answer for in the ways that it's promised mapping to be part of that contract. Like there's a very definite narrative at a lot of schools, not all, but at a lot of schools where it's like you come and you get a GIS degree and we're gonna prepare you for a stable kind of middle class life moving forward. And that's incredibly appealing to a lot of students. And they come to us with that promise. I'm not one of those people that will shit on Esri just because it's fun, because I think that shitting on Mapbox is equally fair. And where, if not more so, and but Esri very much instantiated itself within the academy as this pathway to a kind of middle class promise that for a lot of students at an institution where I work is incredibly seductive, is incredibly powerful. That narrative is super powerful, and in some ways it's true, and that's where I feel a lot of the hard ethics questions that I've had to answer in the recent years have been right there, because I know my politics, I have them tattooed on my back in a literal sense, yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, I'll show you it later, but sorry, but I know my politics, but the politics of my students aren't necessarily mine, and you don't have to look at my tattoos.
Okay. So I'm going to answer this in a different way of I think the question that Craig wrote down was, what do you feel is the most overlooked ethical consideration? And the way that I would answer this is, who owns the data that has been created by the people? And this comes at multiple levels of the data, that Twitter data, who owns it and who has the tools to use it and repurpose it. And I get probably 3 to 5 emails every single week asking me for data, specifically the data that I have from mapping hate speech. And I see it as kind of my ethical obligation, even though it's my ethical obligation to white supremacists, is to protect their locational privacy. Is that I can't release that data because you can zoom in to 8-9 decimal places on where someone lives. And that's somebody who has produced what I consider hateful rhetoric. And I have exactly the quote that they said, the date they said it, the location they were at. And I feel like that data is too sensitive to share, even though it was created by the people. And it is technically publicly accessible, but I've categorized it, I've filtered it, I've modified it. And so I think that is, for me, an ethical consideration, as I believe very strongly in open source information, and open source data, and open source software, but yet my data is closed. And my data is closed for ethical reasons. And in the United States, the Obama administration in 2008 had their Open Data and Transparency Act, where they suggested federal agencies, or they mandated federal agencies to publicly post their data to data.gov. And there's already in the United States, there are several laws about map data, like USGS can't charge you for their maps. Those maps, you paid for them with your taxes, and it would be double taxation if they charged you to sell you that data back. But what I'm noticing is that only applies to the federal government. State government, which our taxes also pay for that data to be collected, it doesn't necessarily get reproduced and returned to the citizens, or you have to file a Freedom of Information Act request, which gets really, really problematic, because you're like, well, you can tell me the location, I won't share it. And that is an ethical thing in my mind, of like this open versus closed information.
So I don't have a ton to say on this topic, but one thing I would say is that we've been talking about, the guerrilla cartography folks have been talking about trying to get our map contributors to share the data that they use to make the maps. So far we've just asked them to list sources, and then we just kind of go from there. But we've talked about trying to make a database of sorts that is accessible to anyone, where you can go and look at the data that was mapped. So we're talking about doing that. We haven't done it yet because it requires a good bit of technical effort to do that. But also, we should talk later about this hate speech map, because there's another map that I'm working on looking at the effects of that hate speech and harassment on campuses. Yeah, so
I have a bunch of it.
Cool.
So I normally think the thing that we don't think enough about is what the map does when you've released it to the world. Like, what are the unintended consequences of your work? It's something that I try to work through with students, and I have this really lousy example about, like, wouldn't it be really great if we could map where all the homeless camps in town are, because then we could see if they were close to services, and we could get the city to move the services. And it's like, so what do you guys think about this? It's like, oh, it's great. It's like, what else could you do with this map? And we worked through to you could go round up all the homeless people. And we're like, yeah, so should we make this map? Is it worth making this map? And the answer has always been, no, it's not worth making this map. And so that's kind of the thought that I try to go through is like, okay, so what's the worst case scenario that this map does when we let it go? But now I want to change my answer to the data ownership. Because I try to think about, like, who gets it at the end? Like, we made this for a community organization. Is it in a format, is the map in a format that they can use and update and is theirs? Or is it something that we're handing to them and kind of loaning to them, but they can't really use, that they have to come back to us? But yeah, the data is super important.
I'm going to do a couple of things here. One is solely self-interested. Renee and I and some other people are doing a workshop tomorrow at McGill, and you're all sort of invited to come and show up. It'll be on critical GIS, and I can promise that I will literally be talking about data because that's most of what I talk about when I'm not at NASIS, and is kind of what I write about a lot with Craig. And so yes, come to that. And if you need more details, like, tweet at me or actually tweet at Renee, because I don't actually have any means of using the internet. So do that. And then the second thing I wanted to do was tout one of my students, because I think she raised one. She's not here. I wish she was. But she raised one of the most interesting ethical questions I've ever seen. She took LiDAR data, just LiDAR, published by the state government, and she trained a neural network on that data to identify indigenous burial mounds. And she did it from the perspective of, I want to, help cultural resource management, which is in the U.S. is incredibly underfunded and doesn't have the ability to protect all of the things it should protect. But she trained it, and I think it had like a 78% accuracy rate. and so its hit rate was astonishing. And if you, for example, were someone that was interested in looting indigenous burial mounds, the neural network she trained was incredibly useful. But nothing she did wasn't data that was publicly available. She just took the skills that we had that we had worked together to develop, and on the data that was publicly available, and created something that produced a map that would be very valuable to a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And so what does that mean? Who owns that, right? And this is a thing we're navigating right now, because she wants to go on to get a PhD and she wants to publish from this work she did. And how do you publish from that in an ethically responsible way? Because for cultural resource managers, that's an incredibly useful map, because it saves them time and hours person hours that they don't have. It saves them labor time. From if you just put that map out in the public, that's dangerous. And what do you do? Who owns that? And suddenly, and the deeper question here is, all of the data she used is public. And so who owns that? And who owns the algorithm she trained and developed and what have you? So I don't have an answer there. I'm throwing that out as a thing. Renee, do you wanna?
Nope.
Oh no! But you always
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for coming out this morning. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and by all means, check out the Critical GIS workshop tomorrow morning. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yay.